Chapter 2, A Misunderstanding. There were a lot of things Murph and his family didn't know about the new town. But the most important thing they didn't know was where Murph was going to go to school. His mum had tried to sort it out before they arrived, but everywhere seemed to be full. And as the hot days of August drew on, she became more and more obsessed with finding him a place. She spent all evening on her laptop, chatting to other parents and trying to get tips. She even started accosting random mums and dads in the town and asking them where their children went to school and whether any of their friends were thinking of emigrating. Murph was mortified. Andy, who was 5 years older, had a place at a local college and thought it was hilarious.
Maybe you can teach yourself at home,
he teased him.
We'll get you a few books and you can set a timer telling you when you can take a break.
Murph didn't think that was funny at the time, and he thought it was even less funny when August rolled round into September and Andy went off to college.
Still no school for you, little bro, sorry,
he said, ruffling Murph's hair as he headed out the door. It was just about the worst week so far. Murph tagged after his mum as she went for meetings at every secondary school in town. Curious faces watched him as he tailed her past packed classrooms and into the offices of different head teachers. He sat quietly and, as instructed, tried to look unusually clever. But every time the answer was the same. They would just have to wait. Then, a few days into this head-meltingly depressing process, Murph and his mum were on their way home from the shops. The streets were fairly empty. Most people were inside having their tea. A woman and a boy, only a little older than Murph, turned out of a dingy-looking side street not far ahead, and they overheard her saying,
"So, how was school?"
Murph's mum, whose ears had developed a bat-like ability to home in on any word connected to education, sped up, gripping Murph's hand tightly.
"Mom, let go,"
he pleaded. But looking up at her face, he realized there was no point arguing. This was Mum on a mission. By the time they'd crossed the road, the other boy and his mother had already climbed into a car. For a moment, Murph was worried his mum was going to spread eagle herself on the bonnet to try and stop them leaving. But instead, she turned into the side road they'd come out of, still dragging Murph along behind her like a low-quality kite. If the street had looked dingy from a distance, close up, it was positively murky. A few cars were parked on the scrubby grass verge, and the gardens in front of many of the grubby terraced houses were so scruffy, it looked like the wheelie bins were actually there to smarten them up a bit. But about halfway down the street was a large school. They knew it was a school because, apart from the railings and familiar-looking classroom buildings on the other side of the front yard, there was a metal sign over the gates that simply read, "The School." A man was in front of it with his back to them, locking the gates. Murph actually heard a loud clicking sound as his mum gritted her teeth with determination and began to cross the road.
"Smarten yourself up,"
she hissed at him so fiercely that he actually did try and iron the front of his t-shirt with his hands. Then she changed her tone completely and fluted, "Excuse me," in a voice that would have put even an unusually posh duchess to shame. The man slowly turned around. Murph's mum had started to say, "Excuse me," again, but it turned into a kind of throat-clearing noise on the way out.
Excuse me.
He didn't look like a normal sort of teacher. He had very dark, shiny, slicked-down hair with one large curl plastered in the middle of his forehead. He was wearing a shabby-looking tweed jacket, but above the elbow patches, his arms bulged with muscle. Behind thick-rimmed black glasses, his eyes were bright blue. His jaw was so chiseled, it looked like it had been carved out of wood.
"Can I help you with something, Mom?"
asked the strange sort of teacher. Murph's mum finally recovered her voice and asked, "This is a school, isn't it?" The man looked very much as if he'd like to say no, but then glanced up at the sign over his head. "Yes," he replied, very slowly and not very encouragingly.
"Oh, wonderful. You see, we've just moved here and I'm having terrible difficulty finding a school for my son," she began, draping an arm around Murph.
And the man cut her off.
"I'm terribly sorry, Mum. We're not going to be able to help you here. We're not accepting applications from the,
He seemed to be searching for the right word.
We're not accepting any children at the moment. I'm so sorry.
There followed a moment of silence, and Murph was sure his mum was about to give up. But suddenly, she grabbed the teacher by his upper arm. She needed both hands to do it.
Please,
She breathed.
please see what you can do. Murph's such a capable boy. He needs somewhere like your wonderful school to take him in. I'm sorry,
Said the man again, gently extracting his huge bicep from her grasp.
Good evening to you.
And he began to walk away.
He's a boy with so much potential.
Shouted Murph's mum after him.
With your help, you could really help him fly.
The man stopped dead and turned around.
Fly?
He asked in a low voice.
Yes, fly. I really think that at the right school, he could.
She finished, rather lamely.
So you've just moved to the area, and your son is capable, you say?
Continued the man in a low voice. Murph's mum nodded enthusiastically.
And is Murph, flying already?
He asked, dropping his voice still further and glancing up and down the road.
Oh, yes. He's been doing ever so well.
She replied, also lowering her voice to match his.
He really wouldn't let you down. He's actually flying,
The man whispered. The questioning was getting a little weird now, as well as difficult to hear. Murph was busily occupying himself with how he could get the ground to open up and swallow him. He'd seen some of his test results, and it was a bit of a stretch to describe his performance so far as flying. But his mum seemed to scent victory.
He is. He really is. Mr. Drench, would you come over here for a moment?
Called the man softly, and another smaller figure Murph hadn't noticed before came scurrying across the road. He was shorter and thinner than the other teacher, and had keen, darting eyes behind round glasses.
Flying already, is he?
He asked in a nasal voice as he walked up to them, although Murph wondered how on earth he could possibly have heard them talking.
This is my sidekick. That is to say, my assistant, Mr. Drench.
Explained the first man.
He'll take your details.
He turned to Murph and held out a hand. When Murph took it, it felt like his own hand was being slowly crushed by tractor wheels.
Murph, we'll see you on Monday. I look forward to seeing how you get on with that flying.
He swished around as if he was wearing a cape, but then swished back again.
And obviously don't, tell anyone about the school, will you? What? We can't tell anyone? Because it's a secret school?
Murph's mum laughed at her own joke. The two men looked confused for a moment, and then, nervously, the hugely muscled man began to laugh as well.
Yes, of course. I don't need to tell you. Silly of me.
The smaller man looked between them in confusion as they continued chuckling. Murph just smiled nervously and wished he was invisible. Murph's mum and the unusual teacher laughed for slightly longer than necessary. Then an awkward silence fell.
So, is it secret then?
She asked with a nervous grin.
Oh, yes,
Replied the man, swirling round once again.
Until Monday then.
He called over his shoulder as he marched away. Murph and his mum caught each other's eye in total bemusement. Then she shrugged and turned to Mr. Drench, who had pulled a selection of forms from one of his pockets.